Yep.
Okay, folks, we might get started. We've got people online, so thank you very much for coming to Aurelie's seminar. It's pretty challenging bit of work on competition and mammals at Booderee National Park, but very much looking forward to what you have to say, and then we'll have some questions at the end, including from people online. So, thank you.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. So my PhD has been on investigating the role of common brushtail possums in the decline of bush rats in Booderee National Park. So my supervisors for this work have been David Lindemeyer, Natasha Robinson, John Evans, and previously Wade Blanchard, Nick Dexter, and Chris Stickman. So firstly, I'd like to just pay a quick acknowledgement to country. So I acknowledge that we are meeting today on the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. And I would also like to acknowledge the Wreck Bay Aboriginal community as the traditional custodians of the Booderee Peninsula and Booderee National Park, which they co-own, and that's where my work took place. And I pay my respects to elders past and present. So I would firstly like to quickly run through my acknowledgements. So firstly, I acknowledge all of my supervisors who have definitely helped me become a much better researcher than what I was at the beginning. I'd also like to pay a special respect to Linda Neves, who taught me everything she could about DNA metabarcoding, Tyrone Lavery, who was a great help with editing, and Chris McGregor, who was my main help when I was doing my fieldwork. And I don't think I would have been able to do this research without him. I'd also like to thank the Holsworth Wildlife Research Endowment, who paid for my DNA metabarcoding work, the rangers at Booderee National Park, and all the volunteers who helped me collect my data. And finally, the Fanna cohort, who have been a great support system, and also my family and friends who have had to deal with all of my emotions during this process. So just an overview of how this presentation will work. I'm firstly going to go into a little bit of background, and in that I will go into my first chapter, which is the literature review, which will explain kind of the context of why we chose this topic. I'll then go a bit further into my case study, which is Booderee National Park. I'll then run through my 3 database chapters and then finish off with some overall conclusions. So the whole basis of my project is looking at competitive interactions, which are interactions that play an important role in the ecosystem functioning and structure. So basically, we could look at this in 2 ways. Firstly, we've got stable competition, which allows population sizes and species to coexist by the management of the population sizes themselves and also the resources that are available, all of which lead to a functioning ecosystem. However, we also have unstable competition. So these are interactions that are resulting in declines and displacement, often due to a change in the ecosystem, and overall lead to a non-functioning ecosystem. So basically, when we have a change in the ecosystem, this is what can take competition from being stable to unstable. So there are several ways that this change can come about. For example, there can be changes from fire regimes, changes due to losses of habitat, which lead to restricted resources, changes to the number of species within those habitats. However, the one we've actually focused on is changes due to conservation interventions, which are essentially man-made changes which are supposed to help the ecosystems, but can sometimes have unfortunate effects that we did not foresee. So this is where my research is focused on. So to bring this into context, we performed a literature review looking at what degree competition is considered as a factor that may influence the outcomes of competition. So to do this, we reviewed 147 articles globally that looked at competition in a post-conservation ecosystem. So essentially an ecosystem where an intervention has been implemented, and ranked these in 2 ways. So firstly, the likelihood that researchers interpreted the patterns that they observed as a result of competition. And secondly, the interpreted effect of competition on the ecosystem itself. So firstly, based on the consideration given by researchers, competition was more often introduced as a post hoc conclusion, rather than being something they actually investigated. And in terms of the scale, it was sort of averagely important. However, if you looked a bit more closely, competition was more often either a major research finding, or it was considered a generally unimportant factor that's kind of just existing in the ecosystem. In terms of the actual outcomes of competition, most often competition was reported as resulting in species declines or displacements, with the second most likely being coexistence. However, it had very few actual major negative outcomes. So this means there were very few occasions where it actually resulted in local extinctions. The third aim of this paper was to investigate whether we could actually predict if competition was going to lead to negative impacts by looking at the characteristics people are often reporting based on competition. So this is the type of mechanism, whether it was direct aggression or an indirect influence, if this was between species or within, the type of resource they were mainly competing for, and the trophic yield of the species. However, what we found was that in general, competition all had very broad range of outcomes, and none of these characteristics were significantly different or were different in a way that actually correlated to competition. So overall, we could not use these characteristics to predict competition. So basically, some of our conclusions for this was that competition can have a negative influence on the survival and persistence of animals in post-intervention ecosystems. However, it is often not a major research focus for researchers or managers. And in part, this is because competition is incredibly difficult to measure and monitor. And it is also difficult to predict if competition will lead to declines after the implementation of conservation interventions. However, we do suggest that monitoring and modeling ecosystems may improve the detection of adverse influences. So basically, our overall conclusion was that studying competition is incredibly complex. And this is because it's often indirect or unobservable and often requires alternative cues to be used, such as modeling patterns of co-occurrence, investigating avoidant behaviors within the species, or comparing niche use. So that brings me to my case study, which is Booderee National Park. So this is a coastal national park, which is located on the south coast of New South Wales. It has a very diverse habitat and a very wide range of species, and it's also been very well managed and studied. So one of the largest influences it's had on it is over the last 2 decades, Booderee has undergone intense fox feeding, which has been quite successful. So foxes are held at very low numbers now. But this has led to several changes in species composition that have been noted. So firstly, there was a loss of all native mammal predators, and with the removal of foxes, that meant there are currently no mammal predators in the park. There is still predation by snakes and powerful owls, but this likely doesn't fill up that hole. There have also been rapid population increases that have been noted, specifically in macropods and common brushtail possums. And at the same time, we have also recorded declines in small mammals, such as bush rats, the greater glider, and ringtail possums, all of these currently with unknown causes. So my 2 study species were the bush rat, which is one of the small mammals that is currently under decline, and the common brushtail possum, which has undergone a significant population increase. So the bush rat is a small native rodent, which is primarily ground dwelling. And as I said, it's currently under decline, whereas the common brushtail possum is a medium-sized arboreal marsupial. So one thing you can easily note with these 2 species is theoretically they're incredibly distinct, and you wouldn't expect them to have any interaction at all. However, we have noted some important overlaps. So they're both nocturnal species. They have both been previously recorded as being generalist omnivores, which means they both have a quite wide diet range, and also likely a very similar diet range. And finally, they both share similar habitats within the park, so that both of them seem to have a preference for woodland and forest habitats. So to bring this into context, we did develop a quick conceptual map. So firstly, looking at the 2 species without any influence, you would expect that they're not interacting. And we also know that vegetation is incredibly important and likely positively influences the species. However, impacts like fire is a negative influence that would through its impact on vegetation, cause declines in both species. And we'd also expect a similar result from macropods. And finally, foxes have especially had a negative influence on brushtail possums through their predation. However, with the removal of foxes, we expect that this has had a positive influence, and now brushtail possums are growing. So the theoretical new relationship between these two species is negative, and we would suspect it's through competition. So overall, the problem in this ecosystem is an overabundance of brushtail possums. And this brings me to the main aim of my project, the main prediction of my project, which is that increased competition with common brushtail possums has significantly contributed to the decline of bush rats in Booderee National Park. To look at this, we had the following three aims. So firstly, we wanted to quantify the changes in co-occurrence of brushtail possums and bush rats over time. Secondly, we wanted to document evidence of competitive interactions through experimental evidence based on a supplementary food source. And finally, we wanted to determine if there was a significant overlap in the diets of the species within the park. So my first chapter looks at this first aim. And this was basically, for this, we used a co-occurrence model, and this data has now been published in the PLOS1 journal. So a co-occurrence model is essentially a model which quantifies the linear association between either the abundance or presence of two species over time. So for our model, we quantified the association between the abundances of brushtail possums and bush rats over 14 years. And we specifically used a Bayesian regression model to do this. And at the same time, we also modeled the effects of fire and vegetation on both species. So a quick run over the methods for this. We used a long-term trapping data set, which dated between 2003 and 2017, and included environmental variables such as understory and leaf litter cover, as well as the effects of rainfall. And our other main explanatory variable was the number of years since fire for each site. And to model this, we used a Bayesian regression model, which uses the prior assumptions of probability distributions to assess model parameters. And we also included a hurdle distribution as our abundance data did have an excess of zeros. So firstly, the effects of the number of years since fire had a major impact on bush rat numbers and less of an impact on possum numbers. So I'll focus on the bush rat numbers here. So the highest probability that bush rats would be absent was within the first 10 years since a fire. And this was also reflected that this was also when they had their lowest abundance. And both abundance and presence grew in subsequent years. However, the other effect on bush rats was the presence of possums. Now, possums didn't have any association with the presence of bush rats, but there was a significant negative association with bush rat abundance, which suggests as possum numbers continue to grow, bush rat numbers will decline. So some of our conclusions for this is that bush rat abundance is influenced by time since fire and other environmental factors, though the number of years since fire was the only one that seemed to be linked to a natural decline. Bush rat abundance is also negatively influenced by the abundance of brushtail possums. And from this, we have decided that co-occurrence can be used as a diagnostic tool to diagnose threats to communities and understand changes within the ecosystem. However, one limitation of this model is that while it did show a negative association, we still don't understand the actual nature of this association. So to try and get a better look at this, we moved on to my second aim, which was to document evidence of competitive interactions. So the main basis for this experiment was to look at the foraging activity of bush rats. So foraging activity is essentially the behaviors and decisions that individual species will make about choosing food sources. And competition in general can result in limited foraging opportunities and also influence the foraging decisions that the species are making. One way this can happen is through avoidance strategies. So a species may completely avoid an area where a dominant competitor is because they just don't believe that they'll be able to forage for any food there, or they may just temporarily avoid that species. So to reiterate, the aim of this experiment was to investigate the foraging activity of bush rats at baited sites in response to common brushtail possums' presence and foraging activity. To do this, we used a modified giving up density experiment. So this experiment essentially was measuring the species response in leaving and when it chose to leave a foraging patch in response to a stimulus, in this case, a competitor. And we used it as a measure of temporal avoidance. So the general experimental setup for this was that we used 40 black plastic garbage bins placed around 40 different sites within the park and set them out for 28 days. There were two conditions that we put these bins in. So firstly, we had full access bins, which was basically we had cut a hole in the bin out so that both species could easily gain access to the bait we'd hidden inside. And then the other 20 were restricted access. So these had much smaller holes with the hope that they would actually restrict possums being able to access the bait. And to record any data, we placed cameras facing the entrance and set them to collect images overnight. So we collected two types of information. Firstly, we collected the weights and percentage of the bait, and we recorded this every other day. However, because the weather conditions when I was in the park were very poor, this data did not end up actually being useful. And we also collected the camera data, specifically the length of the visits by species and the activity that they performed while they were visiting. And we also calculated the number of times they visited the site. And to analyze this, we used a generalized linear mixed model. And in doing so, we also were able to model the number of years since fire, topographical wetness, and broad vegetation site in type of each of the sites. And we also recorded the amount of rainfall and illumination, so essentially the brightness of the moon for each night. So some of our other visitors, we did have very high visitation from both possums and bush rats, with possums having over 1,000 visits and bush rats having nearly 2,000. We also had a very large number of macropods visiting at certain sites. We had a fair number of long-nosed bandicoots visiting as well, which was quite exciting each time. We also had a single visit from an echidna, as you can see it walking through. And we did have one negative visit, which was we did have a fox show up at one of the sites as well. And I think that one is quite beautifully shaded in the darkness behind the bin, showing it to be quite sinister. But looking at our more statistical results, so the number of bush rat visits was negatively associated with the number of possums visiting. So once again, this meant that as more possums were visiting the site within a night, we had a lot less bush rats visiting. And important to note, there was no actual effect from the type of site. So basically, whether we gave possums access to the bait or not did not seem to influence them visiting and bush rats' response to them visiting. We also found that rainfall similarly had a very significant negative association with the number of bush rats visiting. And this was also the same for possums visiting. So essentially, as I said, we had quite poor weather conditions to the point where I was rained out for a few days. And on those nights, no species were foraging it very much. We'd have maybe one or two visits at some sites. The other main result that I got from this is the effect on the time bush rats spent eating bait. So essentially at sites where there was a very large number of possums coming to visit the site, which to be clear, this could be one possum that was visiting multiple times, bush rats spent a lot less time eating bait, which suggests that they were giving up on this foraging site a lot quicker. And once again, there was no effect from the access type. But I also noted some more anecdotal results. So firstly, we had about 5 visits where a bush rat and a possum were at the site at the same time. So the bush rat is highlighted in the red circle, actually being inside the bin while the possum is approaching it. So none of these actual camera images resulted in a direct interaction between either species that were caught on camera. But I did kind of note that bush rats seemed, in my opinion at least, to pay more attention to the presence of the possum than the possum did to the presence of the bush rat. Secondly, attempting to prevent possums from gaining access to bait is not a worthwhile experience, and it just doesn't work. As you can see in this photo, the possum literally picked the bin up and just ate from the site as it was. And there were even occasions where I managed to catch them doing something like this on camera. But when I went to the site the next day, there was absolutely no change, so you'd never know that a possum had visited. And macropods were guilty of the same thing. So this is a picture of a macropod actually tipping one of the bins over and just helping himself. So luckily for my statistics, they weren't at every site because I think they probably had as much or more of a negative influence than possums did. So some of the conclusions that came from this study was, firstly, there is definitely we definitely found evidence that a negative relationship exists between bush rats and possums. And this was demonstrated by the fact that bush rats eat for shorter periods of time when there is high possum activities and will just visit those sites less. So overall, we would suggest that this is a likely example of temporal avoidance. However, because we didn't actually see any interactions on camera, we still can't explain the nature of the observed relationship. So my third and final data chapter was to see if we could detect a significant overlap in the diets of the species. So to do this, we aimed to use DNA diet analysis to analyze fecal samples to investigate the identity and range of dietary items consumed by bush rats and common brushtail possums, so that we would get a better picture of what both species ate in general within the park, and also have an actual statistical overlap to see how much of the resources they're sharing. So our main questions here are, what is the range of the diets of common brushtail possums and bush rats? And secondly, how much do the diets of these species actually overlap? So the method we used for this is DNA metabarcoding, and I won't go too much into depth of this because I'm still quite new to the area. But essentially, we took DNA from a sample, often a eDNA, environmental DNA sample, in our case, fecal samples, and extracted all DNA possible there. And during the PCR amplification process, rather than trying to amplify a single species DNA, we tried to collect any DNA that was present within the scout and use multiple primers to do so. And this would lead to the identification of hopefully whatever, but as much as possible of what was in the sample. So to do this, we collected 131 scouts over 2 trapping periods, the first being back in October in 2020, and the second between December and February of 2021 and 2022. In total, we collected 78 bush rat samples and 56 possum samples. And then we extracted the DNA from this using a DNeasy power soil kit. For the PCR amplification process, we used 3 primers. So this was designed so that each primer is detecting a certain type of DNA. So we had one that would detect fungal DNA, another one that would detect any plant DNA, and the final one would detect insect DNA. And we did this for all 3 based on the fact that they've both been recorded as being omnivores. And finally, we attempted to identify what this DNA was. So we used a Bayesian likelihood method in which we assigned the sequences to the most likely taxa or the best getting higher order taxa. So this meant that if we couldn't ID it all the way down to species, we'd get the genus or family or order. And then we calculated an estimate for the dietary range and also looked at some within species differences. And finally, using a Bray-Curtis measure of dissimilarity, we quantified the dietary niche overlap. So for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to focus on the more broad results of their dietary range and also the statistical overlap. So looking at the overall diet, a majority of the diet was comprised of plant matter, and this is the case for both species. But And they also showed similar patterns of consumption where they mostly ate plants, then ate, well, in the case of bush rats, they ate a fair amount of fungi, whereas possums ate a lot less, and both ate the least amount of invertebrates. And in terms of possums, they actually consumed very few invertebrates. And overall, the diets between the two species were significantly similar. But looking a little bit closer, so for the plant diet, bush rats had the greatest dietary range, whereas possums had, for them, it was the largest dietary range, but it was relatively smaller. And the diets were significantly similar. So this kind of suggested that anything that a possum was eating, a bush rat was also eating. For both species, their main diets seem to comprise of grasses and flowering plants. And for their actual preferred diets, we did find that a lot of bush rats seem to like prickly couch grass, whereas a lot of possums seem to like a species called wombatberry. In terms of fungi diet, bush rats had a much larger dietary range than possums. And once again, the diets were significantly similar. So once again, this suggests that the few fungi that possums did eat, bush rats were eating a lot more of. And for both species, this diet was mostly comprised of truffle type mushrooms. So more mushrooms that you would find on the ground rather than growing in trees. And finally, for the invertebrate diet, possums essentially ate almost no invertebrates, to the point where we couldn't even statistically determine whether the diets were similar or not. In terms of bush rats, they seem to prefer winged insects, especially net-winged insects like mayflies, but they also did seem to enjoy things like wasps and bees. So in terms of some conclusions for this considerable dietary overlap does suggest that there is a high potential for competition in terms of niche use. However, bush rats do have a much greater diet range and a lot more variation in what the individuals were eating. And both have historically been noted to be capable of diet switching. So this means that if their preferred diet is not available, they can easily switch to eating something else that is more readily available. So both of these facts will actually buffer against any negative influences from the high overlap of diet. So some overall conclusions that came out of this study is that there was evidence for both long-term and short-term negative associations between bush rats and common brushtail possums. So the long terms is that over the large amount of time of this study, bush rats do seem to be declining as possums are growing, and this in the short term seems to be to do with foraging activity. So yes, this association was characterized by restricted foraging activity and likely temporal avoidance from bush rats. However, any negative effects were likely buffered due to diet preferences and the ability of bush rats to simply eat something else. And there were other environmental factors which were also linked to the decline of bush rats. In the case of this study, the number of years since fire and large rainfall events did seem to have a very significant impact on bush rat decline. And despite the multiple measures we used, we never actually confirmed that the interaction we were seeing was actually competition, which highlights how complex competition is and how difficult it is to measure. So if we take this back to the conceptual map that I introduced earlier, we can see that there are three main negative influences on bush rats, and that is possum abundance, the amount of rainfall occurring in the site, which is a very significant short-term effect, and the number of years since fire. So we can conclude that bush rats are indeed a contributing factor to the decline of bush rats, but they're certainly not the only factor. And I would like to argue that with the increasing number of major weather events, like major flooding and major wildfires, these are going to be much more important and significant impacts to bush rat populations. And Finally, to leave you off, I'd like to introduce my favorite photo that came from my camera studies, which is this delightful possum here. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Aurelie. That's fantastic. Good work. Who would have thought that bush rats are declining and maybe brushtails have got something to do with it? Yeah, if we have some questions from in the audience, so great, or online. Yeah, that's a good question.
Thanks, Aurelie. Was there any chance that you could find if there was any meat in their diet besides invertebrates? Because brushies can be really high scavengers, and I wonder if they could be in the bush rats.
Yes, we did consider looking into that, but there were extra costs in terms of each number of primers that we added on, so we chose not to add on one that would look at mammals or any vertebrates. But yes, there is definitely a chance, but I didn't see any physical evidence when I was actually processing them. And the fact that they're eating so few invertebrates suggests that they're probably also not going to be actively hunting or anything like that. But you're right that they could be scavenging.
Thanks for that. And I also have a question about the diet analysis, which I thought was very, it's really interesting in terms of a relatively new technique and what it can tell us about something important. And I guess I was curious about, given that plants are the largest part of the diet, and you picked out a couple of plants that seem to be, more represented in one species or the other. I think two questions. One, do you know anything about those plants? Like, is there the particular grass that seemed to be common? Is there some reason why that would be a good diet item? And then the other part, which maybe is relevant to the answer, is I know that with the technique you're using, it's hard to get a sense of quantity, as in, how much of an item is in the diet. But do you have any way of getting towards quantity, or is it really just a presence absence kind of approach?
So to quickly answer the second question first, it really is more of a presence absence when it comes to DNA metabarcoding. They haven't developed anything that would show abundance in individual items yet. So when I was processing them, I did notice there were quite a few that had large amounts of grains, especially in possum scats. And for the second one, that's actually something that I think would be a very interesting thing for future research, is to actually look at the abundance of their main plant diets within the park and kind of try and match this to how preferred it is within their diet. I think that would be a very important field of study, but my own study can't actually say anything about that.
Through these.
Hi, Aurelie, Paul. You mentioned at the top, I think, that you were interested in the conservation management interventions and whether I was just interested if your work examined whether existing conservation management activities had any impact on those trends you observed, or whether conversely your findings suggest conservation management actions that should be considered.
Well, it kind of somewhat confirms that we already know that possums have increased because of fox baiting. That's research that's been previously done, and kind of confirms that there is a link there. However, because we don't have any numbers prior to foxes being eradicated, we can't really do a post, pre and post sort of study, which would be a very beneficial study. So it is kind of limited in terms of what we can say about the direct conservation intervention itself. And during my study, I have thought of some things that may be able to help bush rats, such as managing the vegetation biodiversity within the park, but nothing quite in depth.
The question, the bait take and the number of fox prints has declined since 2003, and fox baiting was intensified in 2010. But it's a sample size of one because there's only one commissioner. And the fox baiting program on the other side, and the defence lane is different to the one. So, yeah. what we really need is a dozen peninsulas, half of them, so Fox Bay and the other half of them.
Following up from that, then, do you know what the, sorry.
Following up from that point that David mentioned, do you know what the possum rat population is like on the other peninsula?
No, I'm sorry, I don't currently know that, but it'd definitely be something interesting to look at. Maybe to redo this model with them as well and see if there's a similarity.
Beecroft has a lot of black rats. And quite a number of bush rats, but Booderee doesn't have, has hardly any black rats. Yes, it's a difference in the disturbance regimes, because Beecroft reference range also has large measurable objects that are fired into part of the area on a regular basis.
Yeah, I guess it just shows like these ecosystems are so complex, like even with a comparable peninsula, there's different processes happening, and yeah.
Alrighty. Do you expect the negative effects that are likely to be buffeted through dietary preferences to result in an overall stable, low population of bush rats? And what conservation management do you prescribe for bush rat and possums living together in the future?
So essentially, yes, I would expect it would buffer against the negative influences. So if we were able to increase the vegetation biodiversity and prevent any further biodiversity loss, I think that would be a very beneficial conservation action to help them living together. Yeah.
I think we don't have any other questions. Can we thank Aurelie again? And if you've got other questions you want to ask Aurelie, I'm sure she'd be happy to stay here for a few minutes. Thanks very much.